Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the two-day international conference on theorizing anti-casteism, organized by the Department of English, Presidency University, Kolkata. So this is parallel session number 25, titled Anti-Caste Poetry. This session is being chaired by Ms. Ishita Roy. She is a professor at the Department of English, University of Kalyani. She has introduced a special paper titled Dalit Studies and has been teaching the same at the Department of English, KU, since 2018. Delivers talks on the subject of caste as an invited resource person. She reads her research papers on caste in various international seminars and conferences. The latest paper she read at an international forum is Where is the Dalit? A caste subaltern critique of the post-colonial. She has published on caste and Dalit issues in various journals. One of her most recent publications includes a critique of Sanskritization from Dalit/caste subaltern perspective. In Caste, a global journal of social exclusion, besides other areas of research interest, she is interested in the studies of Dalit Bahujan subaltern politics, political philosophy, political theory, Antonio Gramsci, B.R. Ambedkar, caste studies, anti-caste thought and culture. She is one of the 8 fellows for Navayana Dalit History Fellowship 2021 and is currently working on her fellowship project that involves archiving Bahujan politics in Bengal. Her PhD is ongoing at CES, JNU, New Delhi. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Meghumala. That was a wonderful introduction. And I hope I am audible to everyone. Could you
Yes, ma'am.
confirm once? Yes. Okay, thank you. All right, so good evening, all of you. And you are being welcomed to the second day of the two-day international conference, Theorizing Anticasteism, organized by Department of English, Presidency University. And I am glad that I have been invited to chair this session, which, as Meghumala has already said, is parallel session 25, and it is titled Anticaste Poetry. And we have with us for this session 5 academicians who are working and researching on this area and would be speaking on Dalit feminism and poetry, caste and modern Hindi poetry, caste politics through Mahima Dharma and Bhima Bhoi, and finally interrogating Dalit politics. So without further delay, I would like to welcome our very first speaker, and well, there are 2 contributors to this paper. So I would like to welcome Dr. Winmayil and Ms. Vetriselvi to make a presentation for us. Just a short, brief introduction to our speakers. Dr. Winmayil is currently working as an assistant professor of English at V.V. Vania Perumal College for Women, Virudhanagar, affiliated with Madurai Kamaraj University. She has 12 years of experience in teaching the English language and literature. Her research and publication address post-colonial literature, multiculturalism, gender studies, feminist pedagogy. And Ms. Vetriselvi is a research scholar in English literature from the Department of English, Vaniapur Perumal College for Women, Virudhanagar, affiliated with Madurai Kamaraj University, and her research interests are based on marginalized voices of women, and she explores them from an intersectional feminist perspective. And the paper that she would be reading is Apoplectic Verses of Meena Kandasamy's Touch. So the session is open, and please make your presentation. If you could briefly, for 5 minutes or so, if you could briefly put your camera on. If you want to continue putting your camera on, that's fine. If you don't, then at least briefly put your camera on for 5 minutes. Yeah.
Okay.
I request the presenters to briefly, yes. All right, that's fine. Yes.
I think my screen is clear. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Greetings for everyone, for the chairperson and my fellow presenters. I am Vetriselvi, Let me just skip the introduction as ma'am have briefly introduced us. And My paper is Apoplectic versus of Meena Kandasamy's Dutch. This paper is prepared in joint with Dr. P. Winmayil, Assistant Professor of English. And Let me give you a quick note on what to expect from this presentation. This paper analyzes that Meena Kandasamy's touch reflects anger as a form of revolution, bemoaning the tragedy of Dalit women's silence, which caused their freedom and basic rights. The application of theory of intersectionality gives a dynamic view on Dalit studies and feminist studies. And what to expect? The conclusion made here is it examines the accusation of Dalit against elite appropriation and helps to eradicate the fear of additive inclusion. So let me go into the paper. Okay, the introduction. Who are Dalits? So in Sanskrit, the word Dalit means broken or scattered. They are considered as downtrodden, broken parts of the caste system. In India, the Dalits are excluded as untouchables avarnas according to the 4-4 Varna system, which stratified social hierarchy in Hindu religion. They are also known as Panchama and Harijans of children of God. Later, these terms became obsolete and illegal to use. The treatment of Dalits are more or like a hidden apartheid in South Asia, especially India, which has 16.6 population of scheduled caste as professed by Indian Constitution. And the Human Rights Watch it reported in 2007 that Dalits endure segregation in housing. Sorry, I think my presentation skipped. Okay, Dalits endure segregation in housing, schools, and access to public services. And why Dalit feminism? Dalit feminism is a socio-political movement ideology through a feminist frame which references challenges that social norms like caste, gender, and class. What is the need? The need to access Dalit feminism is a separate entity or listed below. Dalit women are share common problems of gender discrimination with the high caste counterparts. They also suffer from problems specific to them. As a subject of triple oppression, made Dalit women as Dalit among Dalits. The triple oppression, caste, class, and gender. This concept is developed by Claudia Jones, a black socialist. This neglect and subordination of Dalit women and the concept of simultaneous oppression plays a vital role in this. Thus quoted by Amrita in her mapping Dalit feminism, mainstream feminine feminism often does not engage with Dalit feminism because it's either frozen in guilt, what can we say now and let them speak, or resolves the issue of erasure by adding Dalit women to the existing frame. And My author, Meena Kandasamy, Ilavena Meena Kandasamy, born in 1984, is an anti-caste activist, poet and novelist and translator. Her writings aims to deconstruct trauma and violence while spotlighting the militant resistance against caste, gender, and ethnic oppression. She explores in this poetry and prose, most notably in her works, poems such as Touch and Miss Militancy. The poem Touch is an anthology, contains 84 verses. The Kandasamy speaks of the shift from care, love, lust, and marriage to oppression of Dalit identity, especially Dalit girl. Jaideep Sarangi in his Mascara Literary Review points out touch amplifies, illustrates, and carries on the struggle of power and autonomy by women poets. Apart from her expert use of language, she has sincerity of feeling and honesty experienced rarely encountered. And what made touch an apoplectic verse? The word apoplectic described a person marked by extreme anger or fury. This anger, experienced by a Dalit woman, unleashes the moral outrage, which is the justifiable anger, directed towards others who violates ethical values or standards, is often accompanied by a desire to shame or punish the wrongdoers. The lines recorded in this anthology are expression of bottled anger, which Kandasamy displays her agony through fierce words as a woman representing Dalit community. The poem Aggression reflects the prolonged silence of marginalized women who waits endlessly for the oppressor to realize the extent of discrimination. At one point, the victim begins wailing for their rights. Some lose their hope, bemoaning the tragedy fall upon them. But as said by Kamala Das in her foreword to this poem, Poetry Collections, Kandasamy resurrects herself as in a country never dispelled the cruel myths in the name of caste and religion. Kandasamy expresses her aggression in the form of apoplectic words. The poem reads, sometimes the outward signals of inward circles may take colossal forms, and the revolution happens because of our dreams explode. Most of the time, aggression is the best kind of troubleshooting. The methodology used in this paper is analytical approach. It makes logical provision to argue and analyze issues of Dalit feminism qualitatively. It helps to identify the instances in which caste and gender interact with one another. It analyzes patriarchy as a double-edged sword in the hands of upper-class women and the manipulation undergone through the role of dominical patriarchy. This made privileged women have fallacy of understanding, strive for equality as an elite appropriation marched by Dalits. Ultimately, it helps to recognize the fear of total inclusion by Dalits. The theory used here is the theory of intersectionality. The term intersectionality has been coined and further explained by Kimberly Kinshaw, American law professor, in her essay Mapping the Margins. Okay. And intersectionality is a qualitative analytical framework developed in the late 20th century, and it identifies how interlocking systems of power attack and affect those who marginalized in the society. Activists use this framework to promote social and political egalitarianism, which of course the aim it helps to analyze how interaction with the multiple forms of oppression can be identified through study of intersectionality, which provides a focal point to enhance the general and separate idea of caste, class, and gender oppression. The application of this intersectional theory would provide an opportunity to evaluate the anger and fear infused apoplectic verses of Meena Kandasamy's touch as it enlightens multiple forms of oppression and the plights experienced by the Dalit women. Next, we are going to look into three main issues which act as an obstacle in the life of a Dalit woman through the three poems of Meena Kandasamy's from the anthology Verse Touch. The issues were discussed in the chronological manner, so please note it down. First topic is role of Brahmanical patriarchy. In gendering caste, Uma Chakravarti classifies gender into two parts. One is class, other is clan, but both are color conscious in nature. The caste hierarchy in upholds patriarchal institutions, ideas of male supremacy, and that indispensable domination over women. Sharmila Reddy states that the Code of Bill created by Brahman Parishad in 1950, which enforces fear upon upperclassmen veiled through culture and customs, concerns which neglects the marginalized. In the poem entitled Becoming a Brahmin, Kandasamy chides these practice of endogamy, which renders the caste system as immortal. She speaks of algorithm to convert Sudra girl or pariahs into a Brahmin. The poem states, begin. Step 1. Take a beautiful Sudra girl. Step 2. Marry her, make her marry a Brahmin. Step 3. Let her give birth to a female child. Step 4. Let this child marry a Brahmin. Step 5. Repeat the steps 3 and 4 6 times. Step 6. Display the end product. It is a Brahmin. End. See, in this poem, we allow us to recall the words of Mahatma Gandhi that people of different varnas may intermarry and interdine, but these restrictions may be necessary in the intersect of chastity and hygiene. But but a Brahmin who marries a Sudra girl or vice versa commits no offense against the law of Varna. This was said by Mahatma Gandhi in hope to diminish the social division. But later Periyar, who also questions the lack of choice and freedom for the girl to choose whom she marries. The Periyar recounts Gandhi's above statement Above statement of a Sudra girl marriage to a Brahmin boy elaborates retribution has to be faced by a Sudra girl as her husband, hereditary Varna, would never accept her as an equal being. This poem recounts the Sudra girl has to wait for the child to marry another Brahmin, and the cycle has to continue for 3 or 4 generations for her children to become a true Brahmin. This faraway result would not immediately elevate her Varna and accepted by said hierarchy. She must wait despite the inconvenience and taunts such as character assassination must be tolerated until the satisfactory end result after the course of generation uh, to erase the said presence of Sudra girl from the gene. The algorithm is strictly for Sudra or Paraya girls, and the society will make sure this should not be enacted by Brahmin girls. The institution of Brahminical patriarchy restrict the livelihood of women to guard the spirit of caste through endogamy as the duty with coercion. Manusmriti states, by a girl, by a young woman, or even by aged one, nothing must be done independently, even in her own house. See, this act of fear mongering through the sacred scriptures of religion in India, especially Hinduism, creates ideal stereotype of women with qualities of submissiveness and encourages to lead the life as a loving and caring mother, pleasing the men of the house, who in turn write the mystical verse on the virtue of women by settling the standard. There are ways to smash patriarchy, Brahminical patriarchy. One must identify the patterns of control and regulation of land, women's sexuality, decisions and thinking, taste, desire, and ambitions, which were shaped by the wider social patterns and hidden beneath the veil of societal rules and regulations. These changes must be emerging from identifying these patterns and opens up new ways of living. This challenge may liberate many. The second topic we are going to talk about is elite appropriation or strive for equality. Elite appropriation is called the person who failed to accept the contextual evidence of a Dalit woman struggle against inequality might contemplate such attempts as one. The Dalit women challenges norms of the society and strive for fundamental basic equality. The newly acclaimed way of living is seen as inappropriate adoption of recreation of the customs, rituals, practices, and ideas of elite Brahmins. Kandasamy exposes this caste discrimination veiled in our history books through the poem Ekalaivan. The poem says, you can do lot of things with your left hand. Besides, fascist Dronacharya's warrant, left-handed treatment. Also, you don't need your right thumb to pull a trigger or hurl a bomb. In this poem, Kansami exposes the caste discrimination veiled in our history books called Egalaivan. The story of a young prince Nisada, a tribal community, tribal hunting community quenches his thirst for learning archer under the statue of Drona, who made from his footsteps mud and gets training under Arjun. The Dronacharya, an authoritarian fascist, enforces Dharmasastra rules by demanding Ekalavan's right thumb as a Guru Dakshina to fulfill the promise of making Arjuna the prince of Pandava to make him the world's best archer. Drona, who chooses to limit the skill of Nishada instead of honing the skills of Kshatriya Prince, these Dalit tribes are known for the struggle for equality. The stories of success and despite rigorous challenges can be seen along the timeline of Nisada Prince. The basic underlying message from learns from this existence of such challenges or denied equality. As Drona or Arjuna both hail from the Kshatriya clan, but Egalavan's desire to learn archery and his success through hardship is viewed as an act of elite appropriation by elite Kshatriyas and an inappropriate adaptation of a life of a warrior clan. The next topic we can talk about is token inclusion or fear of additive analysis. Dharmashastra records social stratification, a division based on caste, varna, and occupation from ancient signs such as Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Sudras. Savarna, Savarna feminism. The word Savarna served as an umbrella term for Hindu caste system. It includes all the four Varnas, but the Dalits and untouchables are called Avarnas and Achuts who are outside of the caste system are not included. So this Savarna feminism consists of elite and privileged members of Varna system argues to include the women of untouchables or Avarnas into the fourfold system of fourfold Varna system. This argument often ends up as a Savarna savior syndrome, who just want to include people who cast outside to include in the circle of Varna system, which still holds the same hierarchy and it would still keep the Dalits and untouchables at the margin and inside, but this time inside the line. Saint Augustine once said, "An unjust law is no law at all." The Savannah feminists, who might have realized the dangers of privileged upper class members and their role of oppressor in this class division, and in order to appease the outrage of the oppressed people, they have offered to include once outcast Dalit under their caste system. But through the status among the social hierarchy is still the same. The Savannah feminists and the white feminism has some common features. They both are right-wing political ideology. They both prevalent practices of misogynist and homophobic ideas, and they both are ignorance on. They both display ignorance on caste privileges. The Savannah feminism would raise a voice against violence of caste and gender as a positive culture without any insight of lived experience of Dalit or untouchables. Kandasamy raised the ultimate question of advocates Savarna feminism, which supposed to provide equal rights to all Dalits, especially Dalit women. In the poem Advaita, the ultimate question. The poem reads, "Can my untouchable Atman and your Brahman Atman ever be one?" In Advaita, in Sanskrit, translate not two. That means both the Paramatma and Jivatma are one. The inner self of Atman is same as the absolute reality, which is Brahman. But the Savarna feminists suggest that inclusion of Dalits in the caste system, Kandasamy raises the question that can the personal soul of untouchable and Brahman can ever be one? She leaves this as a rhetorical question. She never tries to answer or never tries to get any answer from the outsiders, because in a moral outrage as the answer never varies by time, culture or location. Dalit women fear this token inclusion offered by Savarna feminism, and this equivalent to colored women's fear over white feminism and trans persons fear over radical feminism. This additive inclusion legitimates the life of marginalized Dalit women by claiming them as a part of a circle. Still, they would belong to origin, but this time inside the circle. It has more restrictions than the exclusions generally directed upon them, as it would never create equal platforms for specific individuals. In narrative analysis, the person is identified by individual characters like gender or caste. It fails to consider the interconnections of disparities made by both caste and gender. As the theory of intersectionality is extensively against the idea of additive analysis of multiple forms of oppression, as a combination of oppressive factors would often result in social isolation. The intersectional analysis on Dalit feminism concludes four following features: caste and sexual subordination or conjointly fortify marginalization. Dalit women are generally marginalized by politics of caste alone or gender alone. Retaliation to these forms of subordination must respond to both the caste and gender. Dalits are not anti purities, but, but they are against the purest agenda to prove the quoted untouchable as an impure being. The conclusion, this paper concludes Meena Kandasamy, who represents the intersectional identity of Dalit women by the articulation of self through her apoplectic verse, with rage at the treatment of Dalits. Her poetic lines expressed the retrieval of her identity as a Dalit woman by exploring predicaments and limitations. Her apoplectic works of rage aim to penetrate the indestructible ignorance of the privileged people, especially women. This paper also analyzes Dalit women as a specific individual and reason with the fear of token inclusion with the help of intersectional theory and explains the exploitation of Dalit through elite appropriation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Vetriselvi, for that much important presentation. Uh, uh, just before we continue, let me once repeat this, that each participant or each contributor, each presenter here gets 20 minutes for their presentation, and we take questions after all the presentations are over. So the last 20 minutes are left for question answers from the audience and from the rest of us. So
Thank you.
yes, so Vetriselvi's paper was an important one because kind of once again reiterated that very crucial problem that the Dalit woman is, the Dalit woman faces, both being a subject of discrimination for one's caste identity and also for one's positionality as a woman. And it also kind of makes us understand that even woman or the category of woman is not a homogeneous category, but is also, identified on various lines of caste, gender, and accordingly we see the privilege and the disadvantage being distributed, like we had seen in Savarna feminism and their approach. So thank you for that paper and much important point. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions in the end. So I would now like to call our second speaker, who would be speaking on portrayal of caste in modern Hindi poetry, a sociological inquiry. Mr. Surendra Kumar Jandu. Mr. Surendra Kumar Jandu is a doctoral research fellow at Center for the Study of Social Systems, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. His research explores the issue of pain and suffering embedded in caste and class hierarchies and how it is being depicted in modern Hindi poetry. His areas of interest include sociological theory, education, cinema, and sociology of literature. Very good welcome to Mr. Surendra Kumar Jandu. Please, you may carry on with your presentation.
Thank you very much, ma'am. I hope I am audible enough, if you can confirm.
Yes, you are audible, but if you could slightly increase the volume, slightly.
Okay, fine. Thank you, ma'am. Uh, uh, yeah. So the title of my presentation for the paper is a Portrayal of Caste in Modern Hindi Poetry, a Sociological Inquiry. And in this paper, I am trying to highlight how different poets in different period of modern Hindi literature, they have tried to understand the issue of caste. And then I'm trying to engage in a sort of sociological interpretation or sociological analysis of this modern Hindi poetry. Uh, in this context, I feel that poetry basically seeks to provide us the literary sensibilities and visual imagination to understand the intensity of human suffering. It also tends to provide us the tools to fight against structural and relational suffering, which is embedded in the caste, class, gender, religious hierarchies, and does act as cathartic experience or healing in the form of psychological relief from undue suffering. And in this paper, I have used the concept of structural violence given by Johann Galtung and the concept of structural suffering and relational suffering provided by Michael Jacobson and Sophia Marsman, which these concepts I will explain as I will read my paper. So to begin with, we can see that the history of modern Hindi literature suggests that the issue of caste has been at the periphery of the imagination of modern Hindi poets, except few until the dawn of Dalit literature in 1980s. From Bhartendu period to Nai Kavita, caste was not an issue of serious concern for the Hindi poets. Critic Manager Pandey writes that Dalit occupies same place in the Hindi literature as they occupy at the material level in Hindi-speaking regions. So we see a kind of minimalistic representation of the issue of discrimination, humiliation, and exploitation based on caste in the writings of modern Hindi poets. poets. The first expression of Dalit consciousness can be seen in the poetry of Hira Dome, who wrote Achut Ki Shikayat or Untouchable's Complaint in Bhojpuri language that was published in September 1914 in Saraswati magazine published by Mahavir Prasad Dwivedi. It can be argued that the problem of caste hierarchies in Indian society has been dealt by writers in different epochs of modern Hindi literature at the level of literary production in the forms of stories, novels, essays, or poetry. However, there is a lack of consistency and profoundness in their writings. Except Premchand's writing on caste, which has an influence of Ambedkar's Mahad movement in 1927, we don't see the other writers, especially poets, who engaged themselves with the problems of Dalits in a consistent and serious manner. As Professor Manager Pandey contends that writing any story or novel or poetry on Dalits are not as important as it is to see that what kind of perspective or worldview is being used to understand the pain and agony of Dalits. In Pandey's views, many writings on Dalits are merely written with a sense of sympathy rather than raising question mark on the tyranny of Brahmanism and casteism. The older consideration of the problem of caste appears in the writings of Buddhist philosopher Aswaghosh, who wrote Vajrasuchi to deconstruct the notion of Varna system and critique the mythical notion of Hindu social order. He asserts that even if we consider the origin of different Varnas from the different parts of Burma, then how can we associate different degree of importance to each Varna? The historical trajectory of Hindi literature suggests that Bhaktikal poets contemplated on the question of pain and suffering embedded in the caste hierarchies, and people like Kabir, Ravidas, Chokhamela, Tukaram, and Namdev, who came from the lower ranks of the social order, depicted the suffering of downtrodden in their writings. These standpoints question the sanctity of Hindu social order that seeks to legitimize the caste-based oppression of the lower strata. The genesis of Adhunikal, or what we can say modern period Hindi literature, lies in the distinctive historical phenomena of 1857 revolt, which changed the socio-politico-economic cultural trajectory of India in a remarkable fashion. Unsuccessful Sepoy revolt of 1857 marked the expansion of colonial empire on one hand and removed the slightest chances of the revival of feudalism on the other hand. 14th century Renaissance of Europe marked its presence in India in the time period of 19th century, when Indian society was caught in a vicious cycle of religious dogmas, caste-based violence, poverty, and superstitions. The priestly class had dominated the social and cultural realm of the common masses. The practice of idolatry and polytheism strengthened the position of priestly class, and their command of scriptural knowledge enhanced their influence upon the thoughts and actions of the common people. Society was segregated hierarchically, at the bottom of which were placed untouchables. They suffered from various restrictions and socio-religious disabilities. So, in this context, modern Hindi literature was also influenced by the cultural transactions which took place between Indian and British people, and writers like Bhartendu Harishchandra, who is considered as the founder of modern Hindi literature period, and people like Balkrishna Bhatt, Kasinath Khatri, Lala Srinivas Das, Pratap Narayan Mishra, and others were highly influenced by Britishers' outlook and praised the work of colonial rulers in developing a traditional society like India. Both Ramsrup Chaturvedi and Jwarimal Parak accept the contradictory position of Bhartendu Yug writers and poets regarding the praise and criticism of colonial rulers. For instance, Chaturvedi writes that one can see the element of attraction and repulsion in the writings of Bhartendu Yug writers. He cites the example of Bhartendu Harishchandra, who criticized the dark phase of British rule in Andher Nakri and Bharat Darshan novels, but appreciate and welcome the British Queen Victoria. The main characteristics of Bhartendu period poetry are poets concerned for development of social consciousness in the minds of people, contradictory feelings of patriotism towards nation and devotion towards Britishers, use of satire, synthesis of old and new tradition of Hindi poetry, and expression of aesthetics and beauty of nature. Due to the contradictory position of Raj Bhakti, that is devotion towards Britishers, and Rashtra Bhakti, that is feeling of patriotism, poets of Bhartendu era could not engage in a sharp critique of colonial rule and vision of modern India. The issue of caste-based oppression and exclusion of ex-untouchables also does not feature in the poetry of Bhartendu group. Then we come to the Dwivedi era, which starts from 1900 to 1918. The main features of Dwivedi era poetry are depiction of social problems, feeling of patriotism, emphasis on morality and idealism, excessive description of things, diversity of meter, nature description, emphasis on humanism, and use of different poetic forms. Mahavir Prasad Dwivedi described the unity of Varna system and expressed his dismay over things not being same anymore. He does not see any problem in the Varna system and also negates any problematic issues in whole time period of ancient India. Another prominent poet of Dwivedi era is Ayodhya Singh Upadhyay Hariod. His poetry imbibes the element of softness and simplicity. Yet Hariod engaged in a strong critique of unjust social order and fragmentation of people in different castes. He criticizes caste system which has divided people and made the thinking horizon narrow. In Hamara Patan and Prem, poet has shown deep understanding of structural violence and its repercussion in the form of structural and relational suffering. Now, as far as the concept of structural violence is considered, it is given by Johann Galtung, who says that the structural violence implies that violence is built into the structure itself, and then it shows up as unequal power and consequently as unequal life chances. So resources are unevenly distributed, as when income distribution are heavily skewed, literacy or education unevenly distributed, medical services existent in some districts and for some groups only, and so on. Above all, the power to decide over the distribution of resources is unevenly distributed. So Galtung says that the structural violence affects the vulnerable section in most effective manner because of the inability on the part of individual to exercise his or her choice due to unfavorable circumstances in which he or she is placed due to inbuilt structural violence. So this creates the space for structural suffering as well as relational suffering for the individual and his or her community members. The concept of structural suffering and relational suffering are given by Michael Jacobson and Sophia Marsman. So they say that structural suffering is a kind of suffering which is actually built into the structure itself. Which is, we can say, embedded in the very foundation of institutional setting, a foundation that is primarily built on the inequality, injustice, and discrimination to a particular section of society. So it may sometimes look natural and fair in the eyes of many, but inherently imbibes us norms, rules, and regulations that privileges some and inflict pain and suffering on a large section of society. So this structural suffering operates at macro level and affects the lives of people in a significant manner. So caste, family, media, police, bureaucracy, class, and gender can be cited as an example of that structural setup that can cause structural suffering. Now, as far as the concept of relational suffering is concerned, it implies that relational suffering is basically a kind of specific and identifiable group of people who actually inflict suffering on other equally specific and identifiable group of people in the shape of stigmatization, marginalization, or downright murder. That is what implies relational, some concept of relational suffering implies. Now we come to the Chayavad period. So Chayavad period is basically start from 1918 and it goes up to 1936. So Chayavad period in the history of Hindi literature presents the specific orientation of poets who took shelter in nature and wrote poetry on the aesthetics of nature and nature-born creatures. According to critic Namor Singh, Chayavad poetry imbibes the characteristics of individualism, objectivism, and emotional elements. So these aspects of Chayavad can be seen in the poetry of Jayasankar Prasad, Sumitra Nandan Pant, Mahadevi Verma, and Suryakant Tripathi Nirala. So due to lack of time, I won't spend much time on Chayavad poetry. But again, if we look at the specific poem of Nirala's poem, for example, Dalit Jan Prakro Karuna, and Sumitra Nand's poem called Chamaro Ka Naach, we can see that they were mainly trying to put some kind of sympathetic attitude towards Dalit instead of criticizing the caste-based humiliation, suppression, and agony inflicted upon Dalits. So that is the primary critique of Chayavad poets, despite the fact that despite the extraordinary brilliance of Chayavadi poets with regard to their depiction of aesthetics of nature and illustration of human emotions, we can argue that these poets actually failed in their understanding of the cause of Dalits. and somewhere their socio-cultural standpoint blocked their possibility to profoundly engage with the issue of caste-based exploitation. The dawn of Pragativad in 1936 lies in the conference of First Progressive Writers Association held in Lucknow in the presidential seat of Premchand. The main characteristics of Pragativad poetry are its depiction of suffering of oppressed groups, a feeling of hatred towards ruling dispensation, the realistic representation of social life, feeling of revolution, problem of women, and sense of atheism towards God and religion. The main contribution of Pragativad lies in its capacity to inspire writers and poets from lower middle class background. Nagarjun, one of the primary poets of Pragativad era, addressed the issue of massacre of Dalits in Belsi village of Bihar occurred on May 27, 1977, in which 11 people were so dead and thrown into flames by so-called Apoplectic Meto people. Nagarjun wrote Harijan Gatha to critique this barbaric act. This shows Nagarjun's sensitivity towards oppression of Dalits, but one of the primary or prominent critique comes from Manager Pandey, who criticizes Nagarjun for addressing Dalits as son of Manu and calling them Harijan. The writings of Pragativad poets undoubtedly created a distinctive space for the voice of workers and peasants in their writings, but failed to address the question of structural and relational suffering embedded in the caste hierarchies of Indian society to an extent this issue demanded. Prayogvad or experimentalism is another literary movement in the history of Hindi literature which has its origin in Sachidanand Hiranand Aghe's Tar Saptak poetry collection. Aghe writes in the introduction of first Tar Saptak that the poets of Tar Saptak consider poetry a subject of experiment. So they do not claim to have explored the truth of poetry or to have reached the ultimate destination. They are only explorer of new ways. The main characteristics of Prayogvad includes use of new metaphors and simile, open depiction of love and sexuality, emphasis on rationalism, stress on individualism, thoughts of hopelessness and frustration, rebellion against customs and tradition in the form of satire and use of free words in the poetry. I'm citing the example of Mukti Bodh's and Raghuveer Sai's poetry to understand how they looked at the issue of caste and class hierarchy basically in their poetry. So we see that Mukti Bodh injects the element of fantasy, agony, imagery, and symbolism in order to articulate the existential crisis of human life, penetrated by structural violence and inexplicable human suffering. He also wants middle class for its false consciousness and asks them to join the cause of proletariat to fight against the exploitation of capitalist class. Mukti Bodh's poems such as शहर स्वीकारा है रात चलते हैं अकेले ही सितारे मृत्यु और कवि मैं तुम लोगों से दूर हूँ मुझे कदम कदम पर ब्रह्म राक्षस चांद का मुंह टेढ़ा है and अंधेरे में depicts the versatility and sensibility of poet towards the issue of human suffering injected by various forces pervading socio-political economic order. The critique of Mukti Bodh's poetry lies in his inability to see the violence embedded in the caste system of Indian society, and thus he fails to grasp the darkness in the lives of Dalits. Raghuveer Sai draws the graphics of class and gender-based discrimination, as well as the structural and relational suffering caused by ruling class and member of human society in his poetry. But like other poets of Prayogvad, he also fails to capture the structural violence embedded in the caste system. I am skipping this part of Nai Kavita, how poets wrote during this era because of the time constraint. Then I will directly move on to the Dalit literature and Dalit poetry specifically. The significant changes on the political surface brought the transformation in the character of social and cultural realm. The establishment of BP Mandal Commission by Morarji Desai government on January 1st, 1979 to look into the matter of social and educational backwardness of OBCs, the formation of Bahujan Samajwadi Party by Kansi Ram on April 14, 1984, and emergence of politics of Bahujans in states like Bihar and Uttar Pradesh altered the consciousness of the oppressed classes. The quest for establishing a free social order on the principle of liberty, equality, and fraternity led the writers of 80s, 1980s, and 90s to write the literature from the standpoint of oppressed communities. The prominent names in Dalit poetry are Om Prakash Valmiki, Malkhan Singh, Adam Gondwi, Mohandas Nemisarai, Kamal Bharti, Sarad Kokash, N.R. Sagar, Jayaprakash Kardam, Anita Bharti, Rajni Tilak, Rajat Rani Minu, and Susila Tagore. Dalit literature draws its inspiration from Buddhist literature and Bhakti poets like Kabir, Ravidas, Gora, Chokhamela, Karam Mela, and thinkers like Narayan Guru, Jyotiba Phule, Savitribai Phule, and B.R. Ambedkar. Sociologist Professor Vivek Kumar point out the significance of Dalit literature to understand Dalit society and culture, and lays emphasis on inclusion of Dalit writings in the curriculum of sociology to enrich what C. Wright Mills calls sociological imagination of the young minds. He writes that as Dalit writings have emerged from the sufferings and exclusion faced by Dalits in different regions of the country and demand liberation from the same, there is a sense of unity and purpose in them. The poetry of Om Prakash Valmiki, for instance, imbibes the element of rebellion against the humiliation, exploitation, stigmatization, and exclusion faced by the poet himself and Dalit community. So Valmiki in his poems talks about the pain and suffering of Dalits and inhuman nature of their oppressor. In his poems, clouds, mountains, firefly, river, sun, stars, and sand are not the embodiment of romanticism like the poets of Chayavad or Prayogvad, but represent the image of patience, perseverance, persistence, and courage. The poet does not make hue and cry in his poems, rather makes direct eye contact with the oppressors and raises question mark over the so-called civility of their culture, which has forced a section of human society at the margins. So it is evident in his poems like Tab Tum Kya Karoge and Kabhi Socha Hai. Poet asks a series of questions to his oppressors in Tab Tum Kya Karoge, and writes that if the same conditions are encountered by them, their color of the skin will turn black and dusky and they will become handicapped. So he writes, for example, that यदि तुम्हें धकेल कर गांव से बाहर कर दिया जाए, पानी तक न लेने दिया जाए, कुएं से दुदकारा फटकारा जाए चिलचिलाती दोपहर में, कहा जाए तोड़ने को पत्थर, काम के बदले दिया जाए रोक खाने को जूठन, तब तुम क्या करोगे? Likewise, the poet in his poem Kabhi Socha Hai asks his exploiters to think about the question of why people from so-called low caste are victims of Varna system and consider them as strangers. So he writes that कभी सोचा है गंदे नाले के किनारे बसे वर्ण व्यवस्था के मारे लोग इस तरह क्यों जीते हैं, कभी पराए तुम पराए क्यों लगते हो उन्हें कभी सोचा है. The poetry of Susila Tagore is poetry of courage and resilience of women against the feudal patriarchal human society. She engaged in a strong critique of structural violence and suffering embedded in the patriarchal system of this Indian society. She also talks about the triple oppression of Dalit women because of their specific standpoint in society, entangled with caste, class, and gender. Another prominent poet of Dalit literature is Rajni Tilak, who talks of women's suppressed dreams and exploitation by men in her poems. In Pyar, Aurat, and Sankal poems, poetess speaks of domestic violence and exploitation of women. So Manager Ponde calls the aesthetics of Dalit literature as the aesthetics of resistance and believes that this kind of literature will enrich the canvas of Hindi literature and fulfill the purpose of removing the evils of casteism, narrowness, inertia, and psychic backwardness of Hindi-speaking society. Thank you so much for patient listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Surendra. That was again a very important paper. You explored into the nuances of non-Dalit representation of the Dalit question in the context of modern Hindi poetry. And we also see that it is true, like you said, that there is an invisibilization of caste problem. There's a general culture of not trying to or not taking caste into consideration. And then, of course, the inadequacy of representation that you spoke about, inadequacy of the caste question. Then there are, the spirit of representation, the kind of pity and patronizing spirit that is there. Thank you for the paper. I'm sure there will be questions. So thank you again. So with this, we move to our third speaker today, Ms. Shibangi Dash. She would be reading Historicizing Anticaste Resistance of Bhima Bhoi. Shibangi Dash is an assistant professor in the Department of English, Gargi College, University of Delhi. Her MPhil dissertation studied the act of deconstructing the Puranic text from medieval Odisha with special reference to Sarala Mahabharata and Lakshmi Purana. It focused on creating a collective consciousness around Dalit identity by rejecting a marginalized position and taking a center stage in the narrative. Her research interest lies in an intersectional study of caste, oral literature, food studies, and Odia literature. So I welcome Ms. Shibangi Dash to make a presentation. You may carry on. You have
Thank
20
you.
minutes, okay? Yes,
Yes,
please.
yes. Hopefully, I am audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay. Thank you. So, the title of my paper, as has been pointed out, is Historicizing Anti-Caste Resistance of Bhima Bhoi. Now, unlike the popular strongholds of Dalit movements in India, like Maharashtra or Tamil Nadu, Odisha has not seen a fervent protest against the caste system. But it does not rule out the fact that Odisha does not experience discrimination on the basis of caste. Religion has been the main anchor of social dominance in this coastal state. Caste has primarily been shaped by Brahminism and feudalism in Odisha. Sporadic movements have cropped up time and again to voice out the displeasures of the oppressed. A secular social literary movement can be stressed out in the middle of the 15th century when a strong social protest was made against social injustices and caste inequalities. Sarala Das and thereby the group of five comrades known as Panchasakha spearheaded the movement. Subsequent to them, another movement was Mahima Dharma, founded by Mohima Gosai and later popularized by the Kandha poet Bhima Bhoi. In this paper, I aim to interrogate the caste politics of Odisha through the lens of Mohima Dharma and particularly Bhima Bhoi. Now, Mohima Dharma was a heterodox movement reviving the Vaishnava ethics that every human shares an equal relationship with God. For this, I aim to analyze critically Bhoi's spiritual autobiography, Stuti Chintamani. I intend to outline the history of Dalit resistance in Odisha, which began in the medieval period, followed by the social context which led to the rise of Mohima Dharma. I also aim to explore Bhoi's identity as a Kond, which had marginalized him, yet it is through his autobiographical work that he was able to rewrite his self and identity. He scathingly presented his social critique through his autobiographical voice, and Stuti Chintamani was his tool of political resistance, where an individual represented the community. My paper further interrogates the appropriation and Brahminization of Jagannath cult and how the practice of untouchability had entered into his cult, thereby inviting critique from Mahima Dharma itself. The propagation of the concept of Olekha, which stressed on the importance accorded to the oral, can be drawn sharply against the Brahminical Hinduism, which was scriptural in nature. So, alongside my effort is also to examine why Mahima Dharma could not impact the society in a way so as to alter it, in spite of its alternative perceptions that contain the dreams and ideas based on egalitarianism and equality that contested the established order. Now, the exodus of Brahmins to Odisha occurred during the 4th to 5th century CE. Land grants were provided to Brahmins, which resulted in an agrarian expansion between the 4th to 7th century CE. This led to a systematic settlement of Brahmins in Odisha. Here, the evolution of caste system has been starkly different from the rest of India. Odisha had a predominant tribal population. So gradually, there began the process of Hinduization and Kshetriyization of tribal culture. The religious institution, they received royal patronage in abundance, and the priestly class legitimized the rule of the Kshatriyas. But the transformation from tribalism to feudalism was uneven in Odisha as compared to northern India because of the presence of a tribal population and the lack of sufficient agrarian base, which usually accords a stratified feudal social structure. Now, the advent of Buddhism in Odisha saw the rise of anti-caste sentiments. Anti-caste and anti-Brahminic consciousness have informed Odia literature, particularly during the period from the 8th to 11th century when Buddhist Siddhas or the Natha sect of saint poets who recorded their protest against the various traditions in Hinduism. This was mostly done in the spiritual realm of life. However, a secular socio-literary movement had erupted in the mid 15th century, and this was strengthened with the rise of Sarala Das, a Shudra poet, amidst growing caste inequalities, who pioneered this socio-literary movement. Now, instead of the ornate courtly language of Sanskrit, a language which denoted power and authority, he used the vernacular Odia to compose Sarala Mahabharata and Bilonka Ramayana. There was a political and cultural awakening in the 15th century. This was followed by the rise of Panchasakhas, which literally means five friends, which comprised of a group of intellectual figures like Balaram Das, Jagannath Das, Achyutananda Das, Jasabanta Das, and Ananta Das. They all belonged to coastal Odisha, mainly to Cuttack and Puri, and hence their movement also was confined to the coastal tract. They used Dasa after their name as they considered themselves as servants of God. They advocated the participation of discussion in Mukti Mandap in the premises of Jagannath temple. The Mandap was an exclusive space which allowed only Brahmins to have discussions, barring the lower caste. This fortress was broken into by the Panchasakhas. They were dedicated to the spiritual upliftment of the common man, writing in the language of common people. They led a protest against discriminating social structure, the intellectual hegemony exerted by Sanskrit, Brahminical religious impositions, and the political dominance of ruling class. Thereby, a period of stagnancy followed till the 19th century, when Mahima Dharma gained prominence. The 19th century witnessed an upsurge of reactionary consciousness in all spheres of life. The Brahmins oppressed the Shudras within the ambit of religion and Vedantic principles. The lower castes, in turn, resisted in a similar vein, using religion as a weapon to thwart the Brahminical authority. Now, at this time, monarchy was gradually declining in several parts of Odisha, and the continuation of the semi-independent and bankrupt prince in some other areas due to the coming of the colonial masters made their life worse. Now, because of the loss of political power to the Muslims, the Marathas, and finally British, it created insecurities in the traditional ruling elites of the then Odisha, who became more and more orthodox due to the identity crisis that they encountered. Now, religious ideas have long been the language of protest. The Bhakti movement best exemplifies this dissent. There are no proper historical records, but Mahima Dharma started around the 1850s. It was an autochthonous religious reform movement that grew in the western feudal provinces of Odisha, unlike the coastal tract. It did not have any Western influence in its emergence. A detailed study by N. Charlotte Eschman on Mahima revealed that Chausa, who were the farmers, the boatmen, the cowherds, followed by the tribals, they comprised the major chunk of followers of this sect. Now, it is to be noted that the followers mostly belong to the lower rungs of the caste hierarchy. And the time Bhima Bhoi composes his verses of Stuti Chintamani, it had those basic tenets and principles of the sect. The followers of Mahima Dharma, they were iconoclasts. They questioned the authority of lifeless idols. They believed in an all powerful, all pervasive, formless, and indescribable absolute who created the world out of his Mahima, which is radiance or glory, and someone who was accessible to bhakti or devotion. They rejected the pantheon of Hindu deities. They accepted cooked food from every house without discrimination, openly flouting caste rules. The Mahima Guru had denied the Raja, the Brahmin, the Bhandari, who is the barber, and the washerman the right of giving bhiksha to him and his followers. The reason being, while the king and the priest directly exerted dominance, the barber and the washerman were the agents who carried out ritual hierarchy. The precepts of Mahimatan embodied a social ideology based on the principles of egalitarianism. They rejected the role of intermediaries to connect one with gods, like the priestly class promised to do. They simplified its rituals and reduced the large number of the sacrifices, the samskaras, and the festivals to bare minimum. It tried in this way to minimize the financial gain which was procured by the priests, preventing them from being engaged throughout the year to meet their livelihood. Mahima Dharma was a heterodox movement reviving the Vaishnava ethics that every human shares an equal relationship with God. The initiation rite or Diksha into the sect is open to people from all castes. It expected people to obliterate their past, starting life afresh, irrespective of their origin on the basis of caste, as mentioned in the Dharma Shastras. The scope of mukti or emancipation was extended to all human beings, irrespective of their social position. Thus, it emerged as anti Brahmanic in nature. Gender discrimination was not seen as women could also be followers of this sect. The men could also lead the life of a householder, as has been time and again asserted by Bhoi in Stuti Chintamani. The question arises what led to the discriminations to be so acute that a radical anti caste movement was launched against the social hierarchies? The 19th century was a period of restlessness in Odisha. The British rule had begun at the start of century at around 1803. The powerful, which comprised of the Gadjat Raja, who were the kings of the tributary states of western Odisha, the Zamindar, Brahmin, and landlords, they created a nexus with the colonial rulers. The natives and the tribals were stripped of their lands. The tribes originally did not come under the purview of the caste, but when their lands were taken away, causing economic distress, they were boxed as Shudras by the Brahmins. The tribal chieftains called themselves Kshatriyas and appropriated their position. This changed their socio-political and economic condition. To enforce more power and authority, structures like temples and forts were built by the Gadjat Rajas. Lands were occupied at the expense of the peasants. So, with peasantization, caste was imposed on the natives in the process of formation of the state. Meanwhile, the dominant cult of Jagannath had also undergone a change. The universalism of the tribal deity, who was initially worshipped by the Sabara tribe, was lost under the ruling class. He was no longer Dinabandhu or the friend of the poor and needy, but now he was known as Bora Thakuro or the Great Lord. He had been Brahminized and the practice of untouchability had entered into his cult. Thus, a cultural difference arose between the Adivasis, peasants, and the Brahmins and Kshatriyas. This situation was accentuated during the infamous 1866-67 famine. It made the society more exclusive. It rigidified the caste system. The food from the relief centers were considered to be quote unquote polluted. So people seeking aid from such centers led to the emergence of new castes like Chhatarakhya. Now, Bhima Bhoi was a Kont poet. Siddharth Satpathy, in his critical work on Stuti Chintamani, calls it as Bhoi's spiritual autobiography. Philip Lejeune formally defined autobiography as a, and I quote him, retrospective narrative in prose that an actual person makes of his or her own existence when he or she focuses upon his or her life as an individual, in particular upon the history, genesis, and evolution of his or her personality. End quote. The writing of autobiography by a Dalit is different from other communities. As Sarah Beth notes, Dalit autobiographies emphasize on their quotidian everyday life without presenting it as something extraordinary. Thus, it becomes an act of autogenesis where an individual becomes a being. There is a transition from silence to sound, from marginalized invisibility to central view. Writers use their own experience to illustrate the community's fate and the survival strategies used by it. The singular entity becomes universalized in such narratives. So, autobiography becomes a literary form of social protest. It is through writing that one accepts the past and asserts one's identity. Bhima Bhoi, in penning his spiritual autobiography, remembers the pain of the near past, which is as piercing as the actual sufferings of the yesteryears. Yet, like autobiographical authors, he overcame the trauma of ancestral humiliations and tried to uproot the social evil through the propagation of Mahima Dharma. Aside from being a protest, writing is also an act of agency and assertion. The role of childhood is crucial where caste discrimination begins. Bhima Bhoi also reiterates how he was ill-treated during his childhood in Stuti Chintamani. Janice Morgan argues that to be marginalized to a dominant culture is also to have had little or no say in the construction of one's socially acknowledged identity. Bhoi's identity as a Kont marginalized him. Yet it is through his autobiographical work that he was able to rewrite himself. Thus, he scathingly presented his social critique through his autobiographical voice, and Stuti Chintamani was his tool of political resistance where an individual represented the community. Bhima Bhoi mentions how he was humiliated and physically assaulted for following a dissenting religion and not adhering to the Brahminical Hinduism. He brought religion out of the scriptures by composing verses which were known as bhajanas and jananas in a simple and lucid language. Even a non-literate person could memorize those verses. This enabled him to propagate the dharma to the masses. He brought out religion from the dominant cultural discourse. He undermined the Brahminic Puranas through his own works like Shruti Nisedha Gita and Nirbeta Sadhana. The Malikas of Bhima Bhoi predict the final conquest of the authority of Vedas and the abolition of caste system. He questioned the social hierarchy and worked towards ripping apart the established structure of caste. He focused on the uniform presence of God in every soul. His aim was to get over the caste barrier, and it was a form of anti-Brahmin agitation. He acted locally in his universal global ideas of equality. He frequently refers to an apocalypse in Stuti Chintamani, referring to the falling virtues of Brahmins and the kings who continuously exploit the downtrodden. After Mohima Gosai and Bhima Bhoi, Biswanath Baba began the third epoch of Mohima Dharma. Bhima Bhoi's works were composed in the form of medieval bhakti literature. In the process of systematizing the teachings for the very first time, Biswanath Baba Sanskritized them. He quoted the Sanskrit Shastras to establish Mahima Swami as Iswara Purusa. The works of Baba was also open to a wider circle for the people who were educated in Western style, who were not properly initiated into the Dharma but sympathized with it. Despite this division, the ones that is the ones who were properly initiated versus the sympathizer in the set, it gave wider popularity and recognition to the precepts. Jagannath cult was initially accessible to people of all castes. Gradually, it became exclusive, and the rules became stricter with the rise of feudal past during the late 19th century. The new Hindu movement reinterpreted the traditions in a modernistic way which could not be easily understood by the masses. Mahima Dharma was a break away from all traditions. It did not just include the non-literate people from lower strata, but also the educated people who saw a new way of viewing their tradition. Unlike some previous social movements, like the one led by Panchasakha, which was restricted to coastal areas, Mohima Dharma spread across the width of the state. The popularity of the Dharma can be gauged by a report on the popular newspaper of the time, which was Utkala Deepika, regarding the number of followers. And the editor even got a letter that expressed fear on the rapid development of this religious system, urging the authorities to take necessary steps to curb its expansion. The act of resistance of Mahima Dharma has been recorded in Utkala Deepika and few other gazettes in an incident of 1881. A group of around 15 to 20 people carrying cooked rice, led by a man named Dosara, had barged into the Puri temple with the intention of burning down the three wooden idols. This incident was initially believed to have been provoked by Bhima Bhoi, which later claims have refuted. Facing strong opposition from the Pondas, a scuffle ensued, which led to the death of one person. In the process, they threw the rice and mixed it with the Mahaprasad. Now, this Mahaprasad is cooked following extreme ritual purity, and now it was polluted. This act, where they undermined the notion of purity, was considered outrageous, and the Dharmites were labeled as Hindu dissenters, low caste, and barbarous people. A case was registered against the group, but none against the priestly class known as Pandas. Now, a typical feature of Hinduism is to reject any neoliberal movement and then integrate it with itself. Similar attempts have also been made to Hinduize Mahima Dharma. Mahima Gosai is often accorded as an avatar of Vishnu, but the Dharma also undermines it by citing a certain Govinda Das or Jagannath Das with the first disciple of Mahima Gosai. And that disciple is believed to be an avatar of Lord Vishnu. It acts as a counter to the dominant Jagannath tradition of Odisha. The Baptist missionaries initially appreciated Bhima Bhoi in getting rid of idol worship. But since the people did not convert to Christianity, they gradually started to call him as an impostor. Mahima Dharma was rejected by upper castes as it was seen to be a low caste religion or another form of Christianity. The tribal population had successfully delegitimized the Rajas and the Brahmins. As Paulo Freire has stated in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and I quote it, the awakening of critical consciousness leads the way to the expression of social discontents precisely because these discontents are real components of an oppressive situation. Unquote. Bhima Bhoi, by his preaching of Mahima Dharma, aroused this critical consciousness among the masses. He pointed out the cause of their distress was the inequalities that they faced in every walk of life. Throughout Stuti Chintamani, we find Bhima Bhoi repeatedly trying to appropriate a Kshatriya identity and gain upward caste mobility. It problematizes his own views about caste hierarchy. Also, one might ask why Mahima Dharma could not alter the society the way it had envisioned despite its lofty ideas of equality. It was probably because it was institutionalized. In due time, we found temples were built in honor of the preachers, immense donations were being made, prasad were being made and distributed, and then it also created a hierarchy within itself. It split into Bolkoladharis and Kopinodhari. Bolkoladharis were they were the people wearing the bark of Kumbhi tree, and they were considered to be spiritually superior as compared to the Kopinodharis, who were the ones who were wearing loincloth. Nevertheless, embracing Mahima Dharma brought the marginalized tribes into the mainstream society where they lived a life of dignity and equal footing with others. The magnanimity of Bhima Bhoi is noteworthy as he desired an alternate way of viewing the society. To put it anachronistically, he had envisioned a Begumpura. He wishes for a better world for the oppressed in his often quoted lines from Stuti Chintamani, with which I conclude my paper. The lines be, too much are the miseries of the living beings. How can one tolerate? Let my soul go to hell so that the world be retained. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Shibangi. Um, your paper surely is going to add to the Dalit historiography, where we need more and more accounts of narratives of socio-cultural resistance to the question of caste. So we are not, it's okay, it's 5:25, so we are kind of running in time. So for today's session, we would like to now call our last speaker for the session today. Miss Amrita Banerjee Mukherjee, who would be reading Interrogating Dalit Politics, Rethinking Anticaste Resistance, a reading of select uh, Telugu Dalit poetry. So, Amrita Banerjee Mukherjee, she is an independent researcher, has completed her master's degree in English from Kaji Nazrul University, Asansol, and B.Ed from Bardhaman University. Currently, she is living in Kolkata, West Bengal. Welcome, Amrita. Please carry on. You have 20 minutes
Thank you,
for your
Madam.
presentation. Yeah.
Thank you, Madam, for the introduction, and good evening to all my fellow presenters. Well, as Madam I have already
Miss
mentioned the
Amrita,
title of
could you just increase the volume? Could you just increase
okay.
the volume?
Am I audible clearly now?
Yes, somewhat. A little bit more, maybe. Yeah.
Am I audible? So, without wasting any time, I'll just go to my paper. Uh, well, uh, Dalit literature in general and Telugu Dalit literature in particular produced after the 1980s is revolutionary and militant in spirit. Brahminism and its injustice towards the Dalits, the protest against the hegemony of dominant caste, anger, self-respect, search for roots, social exploitation are the themes of Dalit literature. The origin of Dalit literature in Andhra Pradesh was a historical event. The earlier social movements argued that economic revolution was the basis for all revolutions. Contrary to this, the Andhra Pradesh Dalit movement erupted with the proclamation of self-respect. The cruel, inhuman incidents of Karampedu and Shibangi were the major causes of the birth of what we can also term as anti-caste movement. Dalits having realized the major role played in society and the humiliating reward they get in return, now fight for the rights they have been denied for ages. They felt it is high time to assert their rightful place in society. Now, poetry is a refined expression of the powerful feelings and philosophical ideas of the poet, as we all know. While defining Dalit poetry, her woman Nimantar states that the Dalit poetry is very loyal to Dalit life. It naturally reflects emphatically the scorching minds of the Dalit mind because its umbilical cord is linked with Dalit society. Dalit poets voice the dumb suffering of thousands of the Dalits for many generations. The poets show their anger and protest and challenge the supremacy of the dominant caste. In this paper, I have selected the translated Telugu Dalit poems to look into the focal point of the discussion, that is, interrogating Dalit politics, rethinking anti-caste resistance through the mediums of self-respect and self-love. Telugu poetry took a new turn with the Dalit insurgency in the 1980s, and as a result of the atrocities on Dalits on Nirukonda, the Telugu Dalit poets become highly alert and declared Ambedkarism their philosophy. Many successful Telugu poets like Shivasagar, Kolalaburi, Enoch, Yandruru Sutkar, Shikhamani, Satish Chandar, Challapalli Sarupa Rani, and many others filled their poems with Dalitism. The poets showed their anger and protest and challenged the supremacy of the dominant caste. Telugu Dalit poetry criticizes the commitment of communists towards the practice of caste discrimination. Well, it is a well-known fact that no menial work is completed without the help of the so-called lower caste people. yet they are not given the proper recognition or respect they deserve for their contribution towards the society. Instead, they are repeatedly humiliated and are made to think that such kinds of work is their lot and their inheritance and obligation. Dalits, having realized the major role they have been playing in this society, now felt it is the high time for them to assert their rightful place in society. Uh, now, the first poem that of my paper is Challapalli Swarupa Rani's very famous that dance from history. Now, Challapalli Swarupa Rani is the first generation Dalit feminist. She is working as a state professor in the Center of Buddhist Studies at Nagarjuna University in Andhra Pradesh. She likes to identify herself as Telugu Dalit woman writer. She is aware of women who undergo caste exploitation and patriarchy exploitations as well. She writes in her poem about Dalit women facing three kinds of oppression in her everyday life, about the undistinguishable evils of the casteism and male chauvinism that convey in her life. The particular poem I have chosen to elaborate in this paper is the translated version of the original poem named Bad from History, and that was translated by P. Hari Patnarani. We can get a clear glimpse of the poem, of the sufferings, the tortures characterized to the Dalits from the time of their birth. In the very first 8 lines of the poem, I'm quoting from the poem. Even as a protest, I was branded untouchable. I was born with the stamp of a mean caste. On the very day of my birth, I was identified as impure, flung into the gutter of superstition and meaningless customs. I have been deprived of life. The Dalit people all are deprived of a normal life. We can almost feel the pain, the emotional upheavals surging in the heart of the poetess while expressing her own experience as a child. A Dalit who herself a Dalit by birth. The stamp of untouchability has been leveled on the forehead of every child. The society branded them as a mini caste at the very time when they were born. Not only that, they are identified as impure and as a result, they are not allowed to enter and live a healthy, normal life along with other children who are born out of a higher caste. After their birth, they are just thrown away into the gutter of the horrible superstitions and meaningless customs. The poet here describes that all of them who are bearing the label of a Dalit in their name, blood, and in their physical appearances too, have been deprived of everything throughout their life, from their citizenship rights to monetary profits, from social recognition to respect as a human being. Dalits were historically disadvantaged and discriminated section by the caste-driven society. Since Dalit is a heterogeneous section, uniform discriminatory practices are not observable across South Asia. For instance, discrimination against the Dalit is more serious in North India than in South India. To escape caste rigidity, Dalits have been experimenting with various options. One prominent option is to convert from Hinduism to other religions like Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, etc. However, even after conversion from Hinduism, Dalits were unable to escape discriminatory practices against them. Dalit women in rural areas encounter sexual assault from outside their caste when to go for work and within family boundaries also. They hesitate so many times to fight back or to report in police stations for the sexual harassment and caste discrimination as they lack education, first of all, and confidence to contest atrocities. Though Dalit women comes as a group and protests against the discrimination, it would not reach to a level of justice determination. As a result, these constant observations ignited Dalit women to engage in writing poetry and other writing forms in Telugu, and it is evident in the form and the contents and the emotions that they express. The poem is autobiographical with its own elements. The writer was expressing the bitter truth of her life that she has been also became the victim of this digital along with previous generations and enduring this indifference from ages. For most of the Dalit women, before they could even open their eyes on this earth, they have been again labeled as a slut for being born in a Dalit community. Chalapalli Swarupa Rani was not very confident at the end of the poem that the history of Dalit oppression, subjugation get a place in this great country's history, or not whether this country's history will include her own sad story or not. He could not do anything but to hope that if this country ever hears their stories, the history of the country will clearly bend their heads in shame and at last into the stone age will find place. I'm quoting from the poem. Okay, now my next poem is by Professor Dadla Venkateswara Rao. He's very much famous for his books like Amrapalli, Parichyalana, and Dalita That We Hindu. Well, I'm going to the dive into the poem. Uh, it is also a translated poem. The name of the poem is Love for the Birthmark, translated by K. Sunitha Rani. The Dalits or the scheduled castes in Andhra Pradesh have been stratified into numerous castes and subcastes based essentially on the caste engine related to status and occupation. Dalits are internally differentiated in terms of occupation, numerical strength, geographical distribution, and visual status. Caste conflict thus lies at the structural dimensions of Indian society in the form of exclusion, discrimination, and economic inequality based on the caste division are intrinsically anti-democratic, and the caste system as an oppressive ideological system represents the scheme of power, domination, privilege, and hierarchy. Its very foundation remains a central obstacle in the path of democratic retribution of power. In the aforementioned poem, the poet here reinforces the positive outlook towards the headship always allocated to the Dalits from their very birth. The poem is in itself showing a self-motivating and self-loving attitude to all the negative and ugly allegations that the Dalits have been facing from the beginning of their existence in the society. The poem is about itself self-respect and self-confidence against all the discrimination society constitutes of the Dalit. The poem begins as such, and quoting from the poem, the mark that sealed with birth transforms into a beautiful ornamentation for one and loathsome for another. Here the poet is speaking about a mark which came with his birth. Here also, as my first selected poem has already mentioned about the leveling of the Dalits to a mean caste, this particular poem is too talking about a birthmark which again differentiated the poet, that is the Dalits in particular from all the higher castes, most identically from the Brahmin. This birthmark is more of a psychological one than a physical entity. But this poem makes a difference in taking a fair or positive side of that birthmark about which the poet describes it as a beautiful ornamentation. For someone, and again, this birthmark, according to the poet, describes it as consent, consentable to others. But the poet does not care for what others think of his birthmark actually. Suddenly, we saw signs of addition to this poem. Now, he himself is that he is actually justifying his mark, his birthmark as a ornament, which is continued till the end of the poem. Now, my last and third poem is by journalist by qualification and an advocate by Professor Srimati Jajula Gauri, who is a writer, a social and human activist. Uh, and the name of the poem is Jajula Gauri's poem, As I As Myself, which is translated by C. Naga Jain. The Hindu caste system, which was created originally for systematic spiritual and social growth of people, has now become a curse to the Hindu society because of its misinterpretation, ignorance, and disadvantages taken by some sections of society. The Hindu caste system is a system which decides a person's social status and trait by his or her birth. This caste system is broadly divided into four categories, as we all know. First one is Brahmin, and the Brahmin is the highest favored society in Hinduism, who by birthright can perform all the rituals, can become the priest of a temple, or do teaching or scholarly jobs. Second one is Kotio, as which is popularly known. The main job of Kotio is to protect society from external aggressions and to keep law and order. Kotio is the second highest revered community, but their status is that of below Brahmin. Third is Vaishya. Vaishya is the trading community. Their job is to trade. Their status is that of below Kotio. Now the final one is Shudra. Shudras are considered to enjoy the lowest status in the hierarchy of caste. Their main job involves physical labor such as cleaning, pottery, carpentry, etc. Now a move to accommodate still others not so distinct guys led to the other unofficial acceptance of a fifth class, that is the Pantama, which is include the untouchable classes and others, such as tribal groups who are outside the system, and consequently Avarna, that is classless, according to the Hindu caste system. As the heading mentions the topic of the discussion in this section, the poem opens with the reference of Chaturvarna. And what I'm directly taking from the poem. The system of Chaturvarna made me the fifth one and pushed me out from the town. The theory of fatalism made me an untouchable and led me to loneliness. The Brahmins betrayed and annihilated me, as we have earlier. The upper class community, basically the Brahmins, are taking advantages to this system of Chaturvarna. The Dalits were left with nothing but categorized them as a fifth class and made them untouchables who are usually do not live with the Brahmins in the same colony or in the same area. They always need to live at the outskirts of a village or a town. So here the poetess considers these systems as a fatal one, which not only made them untouchables but also isolated from the maximum number of prestigious positions, such as uh, any kind of job related to temple or religion or anything else. He accused the Brahmins that they betrayed them and almost destroyed them. The writer blames the politics of the rich people, perhaps the politics of democracy and the politics of the government dragged the lower caste into the streets and forcing them adopt to a very filthiest occupation. Okay, I'm going to the conclusion. In the next few paragraphs of the poetess describes how the community of the upper class Mahajans had made them to work as a bonded laborers without paying them enough or at least what they deserve. Like the two lines of the poem, they sucked out the last drop of my blood. What remains are bones. Now, the Dalit writer's lamentation over the casteism in India is one of the significant ways for arguing a change in the caste-driven society by expressing the holistic vision of Dalit writer's sense of grace. Pain, disillusionment, discreetness, and disenchantment on behalf of his or her community. Dalits are repeatedly reminded of their caste that virtually disfigures their image of self-respect and self-love. These are the expressions of different Dalit men and women writers who have been facing caste issues in their day-to-day life. The stigma of caste becomes a shadow from different directions that cannot be avoided. In modern days, caste practices in the contemporary scenario have transformed from a physical level to the psychological level, which bears it burns extensively on the lives of the evolution of Dalit literature and the prevailing anti-caste movement forced a shift in the entire Telugu literary world in order to embrace its realism, articulating the voices of the people, highlighting the notion of self-respect and self-motivating spirit in the minds of all the lower caste people from the different strata of the society. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Amrita. You have brought in the much needed question of class and occupation, uh, hereditary occupation embedded in the identity of caste. Uh, so we have 14 minutes kind of for the discussion question answer session. So I declare the session open and invite questions from the audience and everyone present here for our presenters today, for our contributors today. So please, you may write the question in the chat box and our host will coordinate the questions. Could we have the questions for our speakers, please? Okay, so I have a question for Ms. Shibangi. When you said that till 19th century there was a kind of period of lull. So do you mean to say, or does your research reveal this that there were then from 15th to 19th, 4 centuries of Brahminization and Khatriyization of tribal culture. I mean, what I'm asking is, would you like to uh, take this period as this intense Brahminization and Khatriyization? Because post that 19th century, you again have the movement, anti-caste movement. So, is that the period, or
Yes, I mean, the fact that when we are talking about 15th, somewhere till the 16th century, we still find the effect of Panchatakas and the ideologies that they had claimed that which is going to establish certain degree of social equality was still very much there in society. But post the 16th century till the onset of 19th century, there is indeed a period of lull, because that was the time period where Odisha as a state was being formed geographically. And we are looking into some of those feudal lords as well as the Garija Rajas that I was talking about, and the kind of impact that they have had. I mean, with the onset of 16th century, in fact, in Odia literature, we start finding the system of patronage. And when we are looking into this patronage system, it's mostly again the priestly class, the Brahmins, the upper caste, who are producing literature. And the literature that they are producing is again further perpetuating the caste hierarchies in some way. Clearly, the society being oblivious to the ideas which were already laid down by Sarala Das or the Panchatathas. So this period when we are looking into, in particular, the 16th to 19th century, given that we find the formation of the state Odisha going on in full force, we don't find any other social movement actually challenging caste at this point of time.
okay? And I also have another question for you. Uh, have you thought of comparing it with the Matua movement in Bengal, 19th century Bengal, given the kind of similarities that you spoke of, like appropriation, and then again going for a Brahminization for themselves, then deification and all of that.
I do want to take this up as a further research project, because even when I got to know a little bit about the Motua movement, I saw, I mean, the points that
This
you
was
just laid
happening
down.
around the same time. So,
Exactly. I mean, if there is a clash of two movements in two regions which are so close to each other,
so
if we
again,
would have.
the common source is bhakti. So bhakti
Yes.
influencing Matua, bhakti influencing this tradition, and there's not much work in this field, right? I mean,
There is not. I mean, a few works had been done in the 1960s and 70s, but post that, there has not been much research done. I mean, again, this is kind of a lull period for the research of such kind of movements, socio-historical movements challenging caste system in Odisha.
Right,
Yes.
right. Okay, okay, thank you. All right, I have just one question for Amrita, and then I can look at the chat box and we can take up questions. Amrita, in your paper, you mentioned this that the Hindu caste system was created originally for systemic spiritual, I'm quoting you, for systemic spiritual and social growth of people, has now become a curse to the Hindu society because of its misinterpretation, ignorance, and disadvantages taken by some sections of society. Now, I want you to give us more clarity on this because I do not quite understand this statement where it says that the Hindu caste system was created originally for systemic spiritual and social growth of people. So do you have an account of that? Do you know that it was created originally? Created, what is it? Or does that area need
Yes,
research?
not through a direct research, but yes, of course, if we, in the beginning
I
of
can't hear it.
Bengali, am I audible now?
Yes.
If you read some very famous Bengali novels and also some uh, Indian English Dalit writing. Yes, we can get that a hint that there is also the labeling of the Hindu caste society has made some portion of negative impact in the minds of the other castes in the society. They most of the privileges in society, most restrictions, traditions by other castes also, and somehow in some people or some sections or some honorable sections of this caste taking advantages, taking disadvantages from this position and somehow making them as evil in society. Yes, I mean now in this way they have made the lower caste people the untouchable and branded them as a mean caste and to make themselves higher caste. So yes, there is no such grounded level research, but yes, we can get kind of typical ideas if we read the Bengali literature or Indian English modern, uh, also the Telugu poetry and the poetry of Mukherjee and also so on. So that's it.
All right. Uh, I would suggest you to read B.R. Ambedkar's Annihilation of Caste, maybe to understand the ideological, how caste system is ideologically embedded and religiously founded. And therefore, the moment we are talking about caste system, like when we are using two words together, caste, not just the caste in which one is born, not just the empirical caste that we have among us, but the moment you're using the phrase caste system, it gets into the relationality between these castes. That is, and this relationality is of course hierarchical, and because it is hierarchical, I mean it gets its foundation from this from a religious ideology, which is the Chaturvarna, which you have mentioned in various spaces, for parts of the paper. So yes, so to say that the Hindu caste system was meant for spiritual and social growth would be contradictory to the entire thesis of the paper, right? Fine. So we
Okay,
have a
thank
question from
you.
Meghumala. How do you think anti-caste poetry has changed over the ages in India? Would anyone like to respond to this question? Meant for everyone, not just the speakers. How do you think anti-caste poetry has changed over the ages in India?
Ma'am, these are from the audience, from the YouTube channel that we have sent.
Oh, all right. This is
Okay.
from the audience. Okay. So the two questions that you have posted, Meghumala, both the questions are from the YouTube audience? I guess so. I think so. Okay. And the other question is, do you think postmodern or maybe even contemporary anti-caste poetry is able to reach the less educated Dalit diaspora at all? Anybody who would like to respond to these questions?
Okay, I would like to respond the answer to the first question, ma'am.
Okay, fine. Please
See,
go ahead.
I will talk about the Hindi literature basically. If we look at Hindi literature, history of Hindi literature, particularly Bhakti Kal, then we see that during Bhakti Kal, there were many people like Kabir, Namdev, Ravidas, and Dadu Dayal. So these people continuously spoke against caste system, and we can see that in their writings. When we later goes to Ritikal time period, then we see the excessive glorification of the emperors and complete ignorance of caste and class-based oppression of the larger section of the society. Then, when we come to modern Hindi period, which starts from Bhartendu, that is something I have already talked about in my presentation. That how till the emergence of Dalit literature during 1980s and 90s, we see very minimalistic representation of anti-caste writings, particularly by poets. So this is something I think that respond to the question.
Right. There is another question. Do you think postmodern or maybe even contemporary ethnic caste poetry is able to reach the less educated Dalit diaspora at all? So this is a question about uh, whether the literature that's at all is accessible to the people the literature is meant for. So
Yes, to a certain extent, it is reaching to the Dalit diaspora. But when we say that, whether it is actually reaching to the less educated people, then through social media, through YouTube, it is reaching out, but not to that extent where, through folk, through plays, through theater. So it is, these are the mediums through which we can spread poetry to the common masses. But of course, as far as their literacy hindrance is concerned, this will be a major issue.
any other question that we may have here? We still have 2 minutes to go. If there are any other questions.
No, ma'am, there are no further questions from the audience. If you have a question, you can say.
Okay, right now I asked whatever I had to ask to the participants. So I think if we are near closing the session, then we may go ahead. Once again, thank you for presenting all the 4 speakers. Thank you, all 4 of you, for presenting your research work. We saw a diversity here. So we saw Dalit, anti-caste movement in Orissa. We saw uh, Dalit poetry, Dalit expressions in Telugu Dalit poetry. We saw the way Hindi modern poetry kind of is inadequate in terms of representing the Dalit question. And again, there is this paternalistic tendency that when we talk about caste, we kind of point out that one of the essential feature of caste is such that, the system is such that it is always expected that the other 3, varnas or people belonging to these varnas would always do the task of representing, would always have the right to represent. And therefore, there is additional effects that come to it in that kind of representational politics. One is appropriation. The other is to look at with the eyes of sympathy and pity, and not really criticizing the basis of the exploitation or humiliation or the discrimination faced by Dalits and the expressions that are voicing those concerns. Yes, thank you, Priyanka, for having me here as well. So we can close the session now. Thank you all the participants. Thank you, audience. Thank you, the organizers.